Welcome to the JD Power Travel Podcast. I'm Michael Vermillion with JD Power, and with me today are Mike Taylor, who leads our travel practice, Jenny Corwin, our lead analyst for travel, and Andrea Stokes, who's our practice leader for hospitality. So Mike and Jenny and Andrea, welcome.
Hello.
Welcome. Thank you for having us.
Hello.
Great. Hey, so this is the last podcast of the year. What we typically do in the December podcast is we take a look back at the year and revisit some of the top stories for the year. And then we'll follow that up with looking forward to 2020, and would like to get some predictions from our team here for next year for the travel industry. So why don't we start with stories of the year for 19. Mike, let's start with airlines.
Well, for me, in my estimation, the biggest airline story, and it continues to be a big airline story as we go into 2020, is what's happening with the Boeing 737 MAX, which everyone knows has been grounded because of some international crashes that led to very tragic loss of several hundred lives. And as a result, the entire aircraft has been grounded and an FAA review. And there's just the whole situation is fraught with a lot of anxiety, not especially on the part of Boeing, which is kind of having to explain how this workaround happened. And just to refresh everybody's memory, this really was kind of a software issue. Some of the electronics in the aircraft didn't necessarily jibe with what was happening aerodynamically, and that aerodynamics caused if you didn't know what was happening, you would make the pilot would make a wrong decision, which is what had happened in those two major crashes. So subsequently, they've grounded it. Now, we've had no problems with the 737 MAX in North America and in Europe. And in fact, I think it's going to boil down to a training issue. What did these pilots know or didn't know that caused that problem? So it was a combination of lack of training and then a technology issue. But there's so much investment capital tied up here in the 737 MAX. It is a very nice aircraft. It solves a lot of problems for the industry. For basically its longer range. It's got a lighter footprint on the environment, and you don't have to retrain staff in order to fly it. So I really think that they're going to reinstate that simply because the sheer weight of what's being invested in it and how it can affect the industry. And it'll take a little, it'll be a story when it comes back to people want to fly it. As I've said before in this podcast, when that 737 MAX comes back online, I'll be the first one to get on board right after the captain. So I really have a lot of faith that it'll come back.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Andrea, let's turn to hospitality. So what was the top story for 2019 for hospitality?
So one of the big stories was the refresh of Marriott's loyalty program, formerly Marriott Rewards, now Bonvoy. Very, very much a legacy program that really was overhauled after Marriott purchased Starwood. And I think this is just, really, the story is really about how the large hotel chains are kind of reacting to the market forces that are constantly, putting pressure on what they're doing. So you have the OTAs, of course, in terms of their negotiations with OTAs on commissions, and then alternative accommodations and kind of the competition that provides to the large hotel chains. All the chains, I think, are reacting differently to these market forces. Of course, 2019 saw, continued rise in demand for alternative accommodations through sites like Airbnb, VRBO, et cetera. And that demand just continues to increase. Yet the hospitality industry is definitely holding its own financially. So I think it's just a constant dynamic that definitely continued to play out in 2019.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. Mike, turning to rental car, I think there's a lot of things happening in 19 in the rental car industry. What was one of the top stories for 2019?
Well, one of the top stories just happened in the last week or two, which is Lyft announcing that they would actually get into the rental car business. And just that announcement, I think just the traders and other analysts read the headline, Lyft gets into car rental business, caused both Avis and Hertz stock to drop 3 to 5% in a day. It has since rebounded. I went and checked this morning. Those prices have rebounded probably 90-95% of the way back to where they were prior to this announcement. And if I think analysts and also other people looked into what actually was going to happen here, which is they're just really kind of testing it in the San Francisco market. And they're testing it only with a couple different types of VW cars. I think Passat is one of them. But they're adding a little bit of layer feature that's going to make it a little more difficult for the traditional car rental companies to compete, which is they say you take a Lyft to the rental car, get into the rental car, drive it around like you normally would for day 2, 3, whatever, how long the term of the rental is, and then drop it back to wherever it was, and then get back in a Lyft and go back home. So they're introducing a door-to-door service, and I think that doesn't exactly fit with the big part of the market, which is the airport rental market, and plus it's only going to be in San Francisco. And there's a whole sort of logistics problems that Lyft is going to have to look into. But on the other hand, Lyft is making this little, dipping their toe in the water here. And based on the success or the adoption of Lyft and Uber and other TNC transportation network companies and their popularity, I think that really has got the industry really sitting up and taking notice. I think it was probably the biggest story, and it only happened about a week ago.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And speaking of Lyft, I think they're involved in our number one pick for stories around airports for 2019 as well, right?
The biggest thing I think it's going to happen is my prediction in as far as the airport side of things is that the changes that are happening around the pickup and drop off of Lyft and Uber and other TNC companies. Really when you contract with Uber or Lyft, you get their app and you're going to be picked up at your door and dropped at the other door, wherever you're going. That's sort of the value of the Lyft and Uber proposition, is that's going to be extraordinarily convenient for you. But unfortunately, with all the traffic they have on frontages at airports, some airports, some large ones, some small ones, have decided, well, we're going to have to modify where you get into that Lyft or get dropped off from that Uber. And the biggest one, of course, is Los Angeles, which created a separate lot all the way on one side of the airport. So if you were going to be picked out, you used to go to the frontage and wait by a certain sign, and your Uber driver, your Lyft driver would come and pick you up right there, and you get in and you go on your merry way. Well, now if you're, say, in Tom Bradley Terminal at the bottom of that horseshoe there, you're going to get on a van and go to a lot that's next to Terminal 1, and that trip at peak times, just on the van, can take you 40 minutes. And so that kind of obviates the value of, your time and the convenience of being picked up at the door. And the other smaller airport that instituted a change was Cleveland, which had a problem with the frontage, so much traffic on the frontage. So they said to the Uber and Lyft drivers, now we're going to require you to drop people off past the terminal. So, and they really didn't do a good job merchandising it, or at least communicating what was going to happen. And people were in their Lyft and Uber and drove past the terminal and got dropped off a couple hundred yards away and had to walk back in the rain or the weather, and it happened in actually late summer. And it sure is snowing, it's cold right now in Cleveland. And so, again, that really led to some really annoyed people that are using Uber and Lyft. But just to circle back to LAX, they had to do this because of what's going to happen at LAX. They had to put that lot where it is because they're going to be redoing all the access to Los Angeles, and they're going to be modifying the parking lots. And so there's no central location in which to do that staging for Uber and Lyft. So this was sort of an advance recognition of what's going to happen in the coming year at LAX, which is a huge construction project.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Jenny, moving to digital. Digital was a big focus for JD Power in 2019 for our travel practice. So what was the top theme or top set of stories around digital for 19?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. right around digital, not just at JD Power, but everywhere, particularly in travel and hospitality. And I think the big theme that emerged was really the use of the digital channels to personalize experiences. I think there's a lot of new and emerging technologies that were kind of talked about at the beginning of the year, late last year, things like the IoT, the Internet of Things, and everyone was saying there's going to be Alexas in hotel rooms. I don't know that that's where we've gotten to, but I do think we do see, there's a big focus on using apps and chatbots and other digital channels to engage with consumers across the travel industry. I also think one thing that we found at JD Power that was pretty prominent this year in our studies was that while the travel industry is making great strides in these areas, they are lagging some top industries, particularly financial services, where those apps and that technology is really embedded in the consumer experience, and those digital channels are just a little bit more grown up, I think, at this point. But we do see a clear direction, and we do see the industry really making an effort to meet the guests or the consumers where they are, and to offer a channel or a personalization option in many different stages of the journey, and in many different phases of life, and how you like to interact with companies. So I think we're seeing a lot of growth there, and I think it's been rather positive, but there's still a long way to go.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. And Mike, just to finish off the topic of stories of the year for 2019, we saw a change in the loyalty programs, which we think is pretty important, right?
Right. Traditionally, mileage programs have been based on usage. The number of flights, segments, how many miles you flew. So going round trip New York to Los Angeles was worth more than going round trip, Cleveland to Madison, Wisconsin. And so, what's happened in that is it used to be, it was a loyalty, quite literally a loyalty program. We're doing this to keep you booking on our airline or our brand. But the finance people have taken hold at several of the airlines, and the trend here is now not to base it on activity or miles that are being flown, but how many dollars you're spending with the brand. Now, financially, that makes complete sense. You want to maximize the revenue at every opportunity to your airline, so it's understandable. But the passengers used to a certain, couple decades long now tradition of, if I'm going to fly 6,000 miles in a couple of days, I'm expecting 6,000 points on my card or on my loyalty program, and that's no longer going to happen. So you can, if you buy a first-class ticket and just fly to, between Cleveland and Madison, Wisconsin, you can get a lot more mileage points, and they're still going to call it points, on some of these mileage-based programs than if you flew round trip to Los Angeles and New York 6 times. So you can really become a gold member in only a couple trips if you're willing to spend the money. And then they've also, based on those dollars, increased the amount of dollars you need to spend in a year to get into the really exclusive clubs. The 1Ks and the premiers and the global services types of programs. And in some cases, you're going to have to spend $18,000 on airline flights in a year to get into that top tier club, and that's a big increase over what was traditionally garnered under a mileage based scheme. So that puts a completely different complexion on loyalty for airline programs.
All right, thanks, Mike. So look, a lot of things happened in the travel and hospitality industry in 2019. So let's switch gears now and look forward and talk about our predictions for 2020. So are we expecting as many changes and news in travel and hospitality in 2020 as we saw in 19? So Jenny, why don't we start with you? What's your prediction for 2020?
Oh yeah, my fun, bold prediction for 2020 is the rise of the workcation, which for many years we've had what's called the bleisure trip, right? That's the business trip where you tack on some leisure time. I think as we see the change in the way we work, actually, to where we have a lot more remote workers, a lot more of our tasks can be done virtually, I think we're going to see people not letting their work stand in the way of their vacation, meaning they're going to take the vacation, but they're just going to take their work with them, right? And I think we've seen that for years now. There's a lot of people that have been kind of dabbling in this, right, answering a few emails here and there. But I could see us doing some smaller trips, long weekend trips, where maybe you're just planning how you can fit your work in while you're on vacation. And I think that's going to change what a certain segment of the traveler is looking for out of their lodging, out of their accommodations in general, right? They're going to need a functional space to get some work done, which is generally provided by hotels. But I think they're going to think about how they plan their days a bit differently. And it's just a little bit different than that leisure traveler, which was really work first, play second. This is really the vacation is the primary objective, but you don't want to let your work stand in the way of that. It's going to be interesting.
Thanks, Jenny. Very intriguing. Andrea, let's go to you next. What's your prediction for 2020?
Well, we've had some news lately about the hospitality and hotel industry outlook for 2020 financially or economically. And a lot of the chains have come out to reduce their guidance for 2020. This is looking like it's really not so much about a slowdown in demand in 2020. So I don't see that. I think there would have to be, a pretty major economic shock to reduce demand like that. I think demand will hold steady. I think this is really about the supply. So over the past, decade or so, times have been good for development. The pipeline of hotels is still very, very robust for future hotel development. So that will just continue to put pressure on room rates as supply continues to increase. I think there are also pressures on room rates, again, from these outside forces, as I mentioned, such as the OTAs and now the competitive landscape with alternative accommodations as well, just kind of continuing to potentially put pressure on room rates for the large hotel chains.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. And finally, Michael, we'll turn to you for your prediction for 2020.
Well, mine is quite a bold one, I'd like to think, which I believe that in 2020 we're going to see some financial interest in buying out, either in a friendly way or a hostile way, one of the rental car companies, one of the major rental car companies, simply because there's been so much prolonged disruption in this marketplace as caused by Uber and Lyft and the TNCs, as we've noted many times on this podcast. But there may be some incentive or at least an attractiveness of cashing out. And we're talking about corporations with huge amounts of assets, physical assets, and which can be, and most of them, of course, are financed, which adds another layer of complexity to it and just makes the industry kind of vulnerable to changes like this. I'm not necessarily saying it's, likely to happen, but I think that we're going to see a little bit more interest in what is going to happen with some of these major rental car companies and what other leverage buyout specialists can actually do with those assets. And I think that at this point they look, I think, somewhat attractive to people who think, now if we just modified the business model here or applied this strategy or that strategy, that I think there might be some potential for a leverage buyout firm to come in and swoop in and take over one of these major rental car companies. So that's my prediction for 2020.
All right, Mike, that's a bold prediction. We'll see what happens in 2020. And so that's a wrap for 2019. Mike and Jenny and Andrea, thanks for joining us today.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you.
And thanks to our listeners for joining as well. To learn more about the J.D. Power Travel practice, you can find us on LinkedIn, or you can visit us on the web at jdpower.com/business. And we'll see you next year.